He stood near the back of the crowd, hat pulled low over tired eyes, coat faded, and boots worn thin from too many years of hard work and quiet sorrow. Thomas didn't come to the auction to change his life. He just wanted a few tools, maybe a mule if the price was right. The farm wasn't running itself, and even after all this time, he still wasn't used to doing it alone. It had been 2 winters since his wife passed. The illness took her quick, and it took the light from the house with her. Since then, the days had blurred together, chores, silence, and the wind. Most folks in town nodded politely at him, but kept their distance. Nobody knew what to say to a man who'd lost everything. And Thomas didn't much feel like talking. He shuffled his feet in the dirt as the auctioneer barked out bids. The usual stuff: livestock, broken wagons, barrels of rusted nails. Nothing caught his eye. He was about to leave when the crowd suddenly quieted. The tone changed. A girl was brought forward. No, ***, a woman, ***. Young, maybe 22, hair tucked under a faded bonnet, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The long coat she wore couldn't hide the curve of her belly. She was pregnant. There was a sharp murmur in the crowd. Even the auctioneer hesitated before speaking. Next up, Eliza, 22 years old, expecting. Terms negotiated privately with buyer. Thomas felt his stomach drop. They were auctioning off a person, not for work, not for a wage, just selling her like she was a broken tool or some extra lumber. A man near the front chuckled. Well, that's a 2-for-1 deal right there. Another added, what kind of fool would want a burden like that? The woman kept her eyes low. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. Just stood still, like a stone holding back a flood. Thomas hadn't seen something so wrong in years. Not since the war. Not since the world made a little more sense. Someone opened the bidding. A low number. Laughter followed. It was all a joke to them. And then, before he realized what he was doing, Thomas raised his hand. $5, he said quietly. The crowd turned. The auctioneer blinked. $5. Do I hear 6? No one spoke. Thomas stood firm, heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't thought this through. He wasn't looking to be a hero. He didn't know this woman. But something inside him had stirred, like a match struck in a dark room. The auctioneer, unsure what to do, finally dropped the gavel. Sold. Just like that, the girl was his. She didn't look up right away. When she finally did, her eyes met his, wide, cautious, and tired. He didn't say anything. He just tipped his hat and walked back toward his wagon, expecting her to follow. She did. The ride home was silent. Dust rose behind them in the setting sun. Thomas glanced at her once or twice, but didn't ask any questions. He figured she'd speak when she was ready. Or maybe she wouldn't. He pulled the wagon up beside the farmhouse and helped her down. She was lighter than he expected. Fragile, almost, but something in her steps told him she was tougher than she looked. He showed her to the spare room. It had been empty since there was still a quilt folded at the end of the bed, his wife's handiwork. He cleared his throat and said, "You can stay here. Don't owe me nothing." She looked around slowly, then nodded once. "Thank you." It was the first time he'd heard her voice. It was soft but steady. Thomas left her to rest and went out to the barn. He needed air, needed to wrap his head around what just happened. He wasn't looking for company, and he sure wasn't looking to raise someone else's child. But something about her, the quiet strength, the way she didn't beg, didn't cry, he couldn't ignore it. Maybe she reminded him of someone. Maybe he was just tired of being alone. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass around the house. Somewhere inside, a floorboard creaked, the beginning of something neither of them could see, just yet was already moving. Before the auction, Thomas rarely thought about the past. He didn't like to. It was too heavy. Every memory seemed stitched with loss, and most days he was too tired to carry it. But that night, after he brought Eliza home, the silence in the house didn't feel the same. It wasn't the usual cold, hollow quiet. Now, it held something different. Maybe the sound of 2 people breathing under the same roof again. Maybe the start of something he didn't have a name for. He sat by the fire, boots off, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. The flames danced in the hearth, casting flickers on the floorboards. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas let himself remember. He met his wife, Clara, when he was just a boy with dirt on his face and calluses already forming on his palms. She was laughter and mischief, always chasing the wind, barefoot even when it snowed. He loved her the moment she smiled at him across the churchyard. They built the farm together, plank by plank. Didn't have much, but what they had, they made last. Clara kept the house running. She knew how to stretch $1 into dinner and still have enough left for pie. She could coax vegetables from dead soil and never complained, even when the well ran dry or a storm flattened the corn. Then came the fever. It started like nothing. A chill, a cough. By the time Thomas rode out to fetch the doctor, it was too late. Clara was already slipping away, her skin burning hot, eyes barely open. She gripped his hand tight and whispered something he couldn't quite catch. And just like that, she was gone. Thomas buried her under the big elm tree out back. He didn't speak at the funeral. Didn't eat for 3 days after. People brought food, said kind words, but none of it stuck. The world kept turning, but as it come to a stop, after Clara's death, Thomas kept himself. The animals still needed feeding. The roof still leaked. The seasons didn't care about grief. So he worked, sunrise to sundown. No one visited. He didn't invite them, not out of anger. Just didn't see the point. The farm grew quiet. He stopped planting flowers along the fence. The porch swing fell apart from rot and stayed that way. Meals were simple, mostly bread and beans. Nights were the worst. No voice calling him to bed. No footsteps down the hallway. Just the wind and the creak of old wood settling into its sadness. He'd gone to the auction thinking only of chores. A wheelbarrow had broken. One of the milk cows needed replacing. Just more things on the never-ending list. He hadn't planned on seeing her. Eliza, standing alone, as if she'd already accepted whatever came next. Now she was in the guest room, asleep, or trying to be, and Thomas couldn't stop thinking about how young she looked. Too young to be carrying so much. He didn't know her story. Didn't know who left her or why she ended up at that awful place. But the way she kept her back straight, her chin up, even when men laughed at her, he saw something there, something that stirred a feeling in his chest he thought had died with Clara. He remembered how Clara used to say, "You don't save people by being loud. You save them by showing up." He didn't save Eliza. Not really. But maybe he'd given her a chance. And maybe, just maybe, she'd given him something back, even if he couldn't see it yet. He heard a soft knock. The door creaked open, and Eliza stepped into firelight, wrapped in a shawl. Her eyes were tired, but alert. "I couldn't sleep," she said. Thomas nodded and gestured to the chair across from him. She sat down slowly, one hand resting on her belly. They sat for a while, not saying much, just listening to the fire crackle and the wind brush against the windows. Finally, Eliza spoke. "Thank you for not looking at me like they did." Thomas didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, really looked, and then he said quietly, "You look like someone who deserved better." Eliza held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. A flicker of something, relief, maybe, passed across her face. And just like that, the silence between them began to shift. It wasn't gone, but it didn't feel empty anymore. Mornings came early on the farm. The sun had barely begun to rise when Thomas stepped out into the chilly air, shovel in hand, boots crunching the frost-covered ground. He didn't expect Eliza to be up, not in her condition. But there she was, already outside, kneeling near the chicken coop, feeding the hens from a small tin. "You don't have to do that," he called out, adjusting his hat against the cold wind. She looked up, wiped her hands on her apron, and gave a soft smile. "I know, but I want to." Thomas stood still for a moment, not sure what to say. No one had shared his morning routine. In a long time, he was used to silence, to doing everything alone. But there she was, sleeves rolled up, hair falling loose from her braid, eyes calm, like she'd always belonged there. She didn't complain about the cold, didn't ask for special treatment, just worked quietly beside him, feeding animals, collecting eggs, sweeping the porch. Her steps were slower than his, her breath heavier, but she never asked to stop. Thomas watched her closely over the next few days. He didn't say much, but he noticed everything. How she folded the laundry with care, how she hummed softly when she cooked, how she always ate last, making sure there was enough. At night, he heard her moving around the house, sometimes pacing, sometimes opening and closing drawers gently. He figured sleep didn't come easy for her either. Grief had its own hours, and they rarely matched the clock. One evening, he found her standing in the doorway, staring out at the field, hands resting on her belly. "You okay?" he asked, voice low. She nodded slowly, then said, "It kicks a lot at night. Makes me feel like I'm not alone." He leaned against the wall next to her. The sky was painted orange and purple, the kind of sunset that made the land glow. "Do you know if it's a boy or a girl?" he asked. "No," she replied, a faint smile on her lips. "I think I'd rather be surprised." He nodded. Clara always wanted a little girl. Said she'd name her June after the wildflowers. Eliza turned toward him. "Clara was your wife?" He gave a small nod. "She was." "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but steady. He didn't respond right away. The wind rustled through the tall grass, and for a moment, it felt like Clara was nearby, listening. She had a good laugh, he said finally, big and loud. You'd hear it before she even walked in the room. Eliza smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't cautious. It was warm, real. "I think I would have liked her," she said. Thomas looked down, kicked at a loose stone. "I think she would have liked you, too." As the days passed, the two of them fell into a rhythm. Not perfect, but honest. They shared meals, fixed broken tools, mended clothes. Eliza started a small herb garden near the porch. Said it helped her feel settled. Thomas cleared a path to the well, widened the trail, so she wouldn't trip when she walked it. There was still distance between them, an invisible wall neither tried to tear down. But it didn't feel cold anymore, just cautious, like two people learning how to breathe in the same room again. Sometimes she asked about the town, about the people. He warned her that some folks wouldn't understand, that they might whisper, but she shrugged it off. "I've heard worse," she said. "They don't scare me." Thomas admired that. Her strength wasn't loud. It didn't ask to be noticed, but it was there, in her stillness, in her calm, in the way she faced every day like it couldn't knock her down. One night, while Thomas was stacking wood, he heard her crying softly in the kitchen. Not loud, just quiet sobs into her hands. He didn't go in, didn't speak, but he sat by the door and waited until the crying stopped. Later, she came out, eyes red but chin high. "Bad night?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Memories come when I'm tired." He didn't press her, just offered her the other chair by the fire. They sat together, silent. The baby kicked. She smiled faintly and placed her hand on her belly. "Feels like it's saying hello," she whispered. Thomas watched her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like it might be something else. It was a cold morning when the letters came. 2 of them, sealed in thick envelopes, both stamped with the county's mark. Thomas found them in the mailbox at the end of the road, tucked between a feed bill and a tattered flyer about a church supper. He didn't open them right away. He held them in his hand, heavy as bricks, and stared down the long dirt path back to the house. Eliza was on the porch, wrapped in her shawl, knitting something small, a pair of baby booties, maybe. She looked up as he approached, her eyes searching his face. "Bad news?" she asked. "Don't know yet," he said. They sat at the table, inside, while he opened the envelopes. One was about back taxes on the land. The other, a notice of inspection. It wasn't anything new. Every year, the county sent reminders, but this time, the numbers were higher. The margin for error was smaller. Thomas folded the papers and rubbed his hands together, more from worry than cold. "We'll manage," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Eliza didn't say anything right away. Instead, she stood and poured him some tea, then sat down again across from him. "I can help," she said quietly. Thomas looked at her. You already do. No, she replied more firmly. I mean really help. I know how to stitch. I can sell things in town. Or bake. I've done it before. He sighed, leaning back. You shouldn't have to. Not in your condition. Her eyes didn't flinch. I'm not broken, Thomas. I'm pregnant. That was the first time she said his name like that. Clear, direct. It didn't sound like defiance. It sounded like truth. He nodded slowly. All right. Over the next few days, the house took on a new kind of energy. Eliza worked at the table, making small quilts and hand-sewn clothes. She used scraps and old fabric in the attic, cutting and stitching with quick, sure hands. Thomas repaired the barn roof and checked fences, trying not to let the numbers from those letters weigh him down. One afternoon, Eliza asked to go into town. She hadn't been since the day of the auction. Thomas hesitated. Are you sure? She looked at him evenly. If people are going to whisper, let them whisper. But they're going to see me standing. They took the wagon, bumping over dry ruts and patches of gravel. When they pulled into town, heads turned. A few folks stared. One woman even crossed the street. Eliza didn't blink. She stepped down from the wagon with her chin lifted and walked straight into the dry goods store with her basket of handmade items. Thomas waited outside, heart tight in his chest. He was used to being invisible. But now, standing there with the whole town watching, he felt something else, protective. Not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to walk through fire and not flinch. When she came out, the store owner followed her, an older man with a gruff voice and a sharp mind. She's got a good hand, he said, nodding toward Thomas. Told her I'll take 3 quilts and 6 of those little coats. Thomas tipped his hat. Appreciate it. They rode home in silence. But it was a different silence. Not empty, content. Like 2 people who didn't need to fill the air to understand each other. At home, Eliza made stew while Thomas chopped more firewood. They moved around each other like 2 parts of the same rhythm. Not perfect, but steady. The kind of quiet harmony that comes only after enough shared days and hard-earned trust. That evening, they sat out on the porch. The sky stretched wide above them, scattered with stars. Eliza leaned back in the chair, one hand on her belly. You ever think things happen for a reason? She asked. Thomas thought for a long while before answering. I don't know, he said. I think sometimes things just happen, and we decide what kind of people we're going to be after. Eliza smiled at that, a soft, knowing smile. The baby kicked again, stronger this time. She looked down and whispered, He's getting ready. Thomas didn't ask how she knew it was a boy. He just looked out into the dark and listened to the sound of life beginning again. The storm rolled in fast. Thick clouds, dark as coal, swallowed the sky by late afternoon. The wind picked up, bending the trees like they were made of straw. Thomas had smelled the rain before it hit. Sharp, earthy, the kind that seeps into your bones. He was outside, rushing to cover the woodpile when he heard Eliza call from the porch. Her voice didn't sound like it usually did. It was higher, tighter, urgent. Thomas. He turned and saw her gripping the railing, her face pale, one hand on her stomach. Lightning cracked in the distance, but all he heard was the panic in her breath. It's time, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Everything stopped. The storm, the wind, the whole world seemed to pause. Thomas moved fast, steadier than he felt. He helped her inside, guided her to the bed in the spare room. Now her room, now their room. He lit the oil lamps as the thunder boomed, casting shadows on the walls. Rain slapped against the windows, and the roof groaned under the weight of it. She was trying to stay calm, but he could see the fear in her eyes. Her hands clenched the bedsheets. Her breathing came hard and fast. He knelt beside her. I've delivered calves, foals, even a goat once, he said, trying to sound calm. Ain't the same, I know, but I won't leave your side. She nodded, her lips pressed tight in pain. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her hair clung to her face. She looked like she was made of fire and iron all at once. The hours passed like a blur. He boiled water, brought towels, did what he remembered Clara doing when her sister had given birth years ago. The storm outside raged, but inside that small room, something much bigger was happening. Eliza cried out, her whole body arching with the pain. Thomas held her hand. She squeezed so hard he thought his fingers might break. But he didn't let go. "You're doing good," he kept saying over and over, like a prayer. "You're doing just fine." She didn't answer. She just focused. Fought. Another hour. Maybe 2. Time didn't mean much by then. And then, just when Thomas thought his heart might give out from worry, it happened. A cry. Small at first. Then louder. Eliza collapsed back on the pillow, eyes full of tears, chest rising and falling like she just crossed an ocean. Thomas stood frozen for a second, staring at the tiny life in his arms. A baby boy, red-faced, angry, full of voice and life. He wrapped him in a blanket, hands trembling, and placed him gently in Eliza's arms. She looked at her son and began to cry in a way he hadn't seen before. Not fear, not pain, just pure, aching relief. Thomas sat down beside her. He didn't speak. He just looked at them, at her, holding that child like he was the whole world. He remembered Clara then, the dreams they had, the name she'd once whispered. "Eliza," he said softly. "What do you want to name him?" She looked at the baby, then at Thomas. Her voice was hoarse, but clear. "June," she said, "even if he's a boy. June." He smiled. Not wide, not loud. Just the kind of smile that stays in your eyes. Outside, the storm began to fade. The rain slowed. The wind grew softer. Thomas stood and pulled the blanket tighter around the baby. He looked out the window at the soaked ground and the clean sky starting to show behind the clouds. And in that quiet, in that small, glowing room, the weight he'd carried for so long, the grief, the silence, the years of doing everything alone began to lift. Not all at once, but enough to breathe, enough to begin. The days that followed felt like something out of a dream Thomas didn't know he'd ever wanted. The house, once echoing with stillness, was now filled with soft sounds, tiny breaths, quiet coos, the creak of floorboards as Eliza rocked little June to the early hours of morning. Thomas found himself waking before the sun, not out of habit, but out of hope. He wanted to hear that first cry of the day, wanted to be the one to carry wood to the fire, while Eliza sang lullabies under her breath. The same farm that once felt like a burden was now pulsing with quiet joy. Neighbors started coming by, though not many, just a few brave ones. Curiosity drew them, but it wasn't long before they stayed longer than they planned. Mrs. Gallagher brought over a jar of peach preserves and, after one look at Eliza holding June, said softly, "Looks like you got more than you bargained for, Thomas." He only nodded, never one for words when a feeling could say more. Eliza, for all she had been through, carried herself with a kind of grace that couldn't be taught. She didn't speak much of her past, but she never hid from it either. When the baby cried at night, she rose without complaint. When Thomas was too tired to fix the fence, she walked beside him anyway. Even if her steps were slower now, the three of them found a rhythm. Meals were simpler but warmer. Laughter, real laughter, started showing up at the dinner table, sometimes in small fits, sometimes loud and sudden, catching them both off guard. One night, Thomas burned the biscuits, and Eliza laughed so hard she cried. June, nestled in a basket beside the fire, kicked his tiny feet like he was in on the joke. Thomas started fixing up the house. He didn't say it out loud, but Eliza noticed. He repaired the porch swing, repainted the shutters, planted wildflowers along the path. It was as if the home had been holding its breath for years, and now, finally, it was allowed to exhale. One afternoon, as Thomas was tending the barn, he found an old tin box buried beneath a stack of hay. Inside were papers, old letters Clara had written but never sent. One of them was addressed to "The Man You'll Become." It was written in a looping hand, faded by time. He sat on the edge of the hay bale and read every word. She spoke of love, of loss, of hope that someday he would find peace. Not by forgetting her, but by learning how to live again. She said she hoped, more than anything, that he'd open his heart to whatever came next. He didn't tell Eliza about the letter, not because he wanted to hide it, but because he wasn't ready to share that part himself yet. Some things needed time, like seeds in winter soil. That night, while Eliza nursed June beside the fire, Thomas picked up his old guitar. It had been gathering dust for years. The strings were stiff, the wood dry, but somehow it still held a tune. He played softly, an old song Clara used to hum. Eliza looked up, surprised. He kept playing, never saying a word. When the song ended, she whispered, "That was beautiful." He just nodded and placed a guitar beside the chair. They didn't need much talk between them anymore. The silence was different now, not heavy, not empty. It was a kind of silence built on trust, on understanding that some things are felt, not spoken. June started smiling. Just little ones, barely more than a flicker. But to Thomas, each one felt like a sunrise. Eliza would hold him up and say, "He's got your eyes." And Thomas, though he knew that couldn't be true, let himself believe it just a little. Spring crept in slowly, melting the frost, waking the trees. The fields turned green again, soft and full of promise. And on one quiet morning, while the world outside stretched into a new season, Thomas sat on the porch, baby June asleep on his chest, and Eliza dozing nearby. The wind moved gently through the grass. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the future didn't seem like something to fear. It felt like something waiting to be lived. The sun was higher in the sky now, warmer, the kind of light that made shadows softer. Thomas had started taking June out to the fields in the early mornings, wrapped snug in a sling against his chest. The boy liked movement. Seemed to settle the moment he felt the rhythm of Thomas's footsteps on the dirt path. Eliza would wave him off on the porch, a smile hidden in her eyes, a quiet confidence in the way she leaned against the doorframe. The farm had never run smoother. The animals responded to the quiet energy that filled the place now. Even the stubborn mule that used to bray at everything moved with more calm. Thomas wasn't doing more work than before, but somehow it felt lighter. There was meaning in every chore, every nail he hammered, every row he tilled. He wasn't just maintaining land anymore. He was building something. For someone. Eliza had started keeping a journal. Thomas noticed it sitting open on the table one morning, pages filled with neat handwriting. He never read it. Didn't feel right. But he'd watch her writing in the evenings, sometimes smiling to herself, sometimes staring into the fire for a long moment before putting pen to paper. When he asked what she wrote, she simply said, "Things I don't want to forget." They spoke more now, not just about the farm or the baby, but about little things. She told him about the hills where she grew up, how her mama used to bake bread with cinnamon on Sundays. He told her stories about Clara, not sad ones, just memories that deserved to be shared. There was no jealousy between them, no sense of being compared. Just two people recognizing the roads they'd walked to get to the strange, quiet joy they now shared. One day, Eliza surprised him. She'd taken a trip into town alone, for the first time since June was born. Thomas had offered to go with her, but she shook her head. "You got work here," she said, "and I've got something to do." She returned just before sunset, cheeks flushed from the spring air, a small package wrapped in brown paper in her hands. He watched as she carefully opened it on the table. Inside was a hand-stitched baby blanket with June's name embroidered in the corner, and beneath it, a small frame with a black and white photograph. It was one of the only photos ever taken of Thomas and Clara, faded, but still sharp enough to see the way she laughed at something he must have just said. Eliza had found it in the attic weeks ago and quietly brought it to a photographer in town to be restored. "I thought maybe you should know her too," she said, nodding toward the baby asleep in the cradle nearby. Thomas didn't speak. His throat tightened in that familiar way. But it wasn't grief this time. It was something softer, something heavier and lighter all at once. He reached out and touched the edge of the photo. "She'd have liked you," he whispered. Eliza nodded. "I think I'd have liked her too." June stirred, let out a soft sigh, and Thomas leaned down to gently place the blanket over him. The boy's tiny fingers curled around the edge like he knew exactly what it meant. Later that week, they were visited by the preacher, an old friend of Thomas's from long before the sorrow set in. He came to bless the child, offer a few words, and maybe take some supper if offered. Thomas wasn't sure if Eliza would be comfortable, but she welcomed the man with a warm smile and set another plate without being asked. They ate together, laughed some, and when the preacher took his leave, he turned to Thomas and said quietly, "You've built something here, something good." Thomas didn't say much, just nodded, but those words stayed with him. That night, he sat on the porch with June on his lap, wrapped in that same embroidered blanket. Eliza joined him a few minutes later, slipping her hand into like it had always belonged there. The stars were bright. The air smelled of grass and earth and something new. There was no talk of the past, no worrying over what might come, just the slow breath of a baby sleeping between them, and a shared understanding that even the most broken stories could bloom again, right in the middle of ordinary soil. The seasons began to change, and with them came a rhythm that felt more like home than Thomas had ever known before. The summer sun warmed the fields, turning the tall grass golden and bending the wildflowers with its heat. June grew quickly, small hands grasping at everything he could reach, his laughter filling the air like music Thomas hadn't realized he'd missed so much. Eliza moved with a quiet strength that surprised even Thomas. She carried June through long days of work, never once letting the weight show on her face. When she sang to him at night, the sound was soft and steady, a lullaby that seemed to weave itself into the very walls of the old farmhouse. Thomas started to see things differently. The house wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a place filled with stories waiting to be written. Every corner held a memory. Every creak in the floor a reminder of the life unfolding inside. He found himself smiling more, not from relief alone, but from a deep kind of happiness that didn't come from words. One afternoon, as the sun was beginning to dip low, Thomas and Eliza sat outside on the porch, watching June chase after a butterfly with chubby little feet. Eliza reached out and took Thomas's hand, squeezing it gently. "You ever think about the future?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Thomas looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. He hadn't dared to dream much past the next day, let alone the years ahead. "Not really," he admitted. "Used to think it was just about surviving." She nodded. "Me too. But maybe now it's about living." He thought about that, about the farm, the baby, the life they were building piece by piece. "Maybe," he said, "we're starting something better than just surviving." Eliza smiled, and for the first time, Thomas saw a flicker of something bright in her eyes. Hope. Something he thought he'd lost long ago. That night, after June was asleep, Thomas found himself drawn to the old piano sitting in the corner of the parlor. It hadn't been played in years, but he ran his fingers lightly over the keys, coaxing out a melody that was soft and bittersweet. Eliza listened from the doorway, her eyes reflecting the candlelight. She didn't say anything until he finished the song. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "Your mother used to play something like that." Thomas blinked, surprised. He hadn't known Eliza knew about his mother. The distance between their paths felt smaller for a moment, like threads weaving together in the quiet. Over the next few weeks, they began talking more about their histories, their fears, and the dreams they'd buried deep. The walls of the house seemed to hold their stories with them, turning memories into something alive. One evening, Thomas found an old journal hidden beneath the floorboards. It belonged to Clara. The pages were worn and filled with her thoughts, her hopes for the future they never got to share. He read by candlelight, feeling closer to her with every word. But instead of feeling sadness, he felt a strange kind of peace. Clara's words reminded him that love doesn't end with loss. It changes shape, becoming something new. Thomas shared the journal with Eliza, and together they read passages aloud, finding strength in the past while building their own story. Summer faded into fall. The crisp air brought new challenges. The crops needed tending. The first frost loomed, and the days grew shorter. But Thomas and Eliza faced them together, leaning on each other in ways they never expected. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the fields, Thomas paused to watch Eliza smile at June, who was crawling toward them with determination. She looked over at him, eyes shining. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" He nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle warmly in his chest. "Yeah," he said, "and I think this is just the beginning." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Thomas felt something inside him shift, a quiet certainty that whatever storms might come, whatever struggles lay ahead, they would face them together. Because sometimes the most unexpected choices lead to the most beautiful lives. And in the heart of a struggling widower who bought a pregnant bride at auction, a new family was blooming, stronger, kinder, and full of a hope that could never be taken away. Winter came softly that year, wrapping the farm in quiet blankets of snow and frost. The world outside grew still, but inside the old farmhouse, life hummed steadily on. Thomas would wake early to light the stove, its warm glow pushing back the cold that crept beneath the floorboards. Eliza moved with a careful grace, tending to June as he slept wrapped in a thick quilt near the fire. The baby was growing fast. His cheeks, once rosy from the summer sun, now held a permanent flush against the chill. He babbled nonsense words, reaching out with tiny hands to touch everything in sight. Thomas marveled at how something so small could hold so much life, so much promise. Eliza and Thomas spent long evenings together, sometimes sitting quietly by the fire, sometimes talking about dreams they barely dared to speak aloud. The silence between them was comfortable now, not empty or awkward, but full of understanding. Words weren't always needed when a glance or a touch said everything. One night, as the wind howled outside and snow drifted against the windows, Thomas pulled an old photo album from a dusty shelf. He handed it to Eliza, who flipped through the yellowed pages, pausing at pictures of a younger Thomas and Clara, their smiles frozen in time. Eliza looked up, eyes soft with something unspoken. She was a good woman, Thomas said quietly. She still is, Eliza replied. The words hung between them, bridging the past and the present. Thomas felt a warmth that wasn't just in the fire. He realized then that the space Clara once filled wasn't being replaced. It was expanding to make room for new love, new life. Days passed in a gentle rhythm. The animals huddled in their barns, and Thomas took extra care to ensure they were fed and warm. He and Eliza worked side by side, their hands often brushing, their smiles easy and true. One afternoon, while chopping wood, Thomas noticed Eliza watching him with a softness that made his heart skip. She stepped closer, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "I never thought I could feel this way again," she whispered. Thomas swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling deep inside. "Neither did I," he said. "But here we are." Their hands found each other, fingers intertwining as if they had always belonged together. Winter's chill seemed to fade in that moment, replaced by something stronger, something that could weather any storm. The days grew shorter, but the light between them grew brighter. They began dreaming aloud, about the farm, about June, about a future that felt possible for the first time in years. Thomas found himself laughing more, not the forced kind, but the kind that bubbles up from a place of joy and hope. Eliza's laughter was the sweetest sound, filling the house and chasing away shadows. One evening, as snowflakes drifted outside like feathers, they sat together by the fire, watching June sleep peacefully. Thomas took Eliza's hand in his voice steady but soft. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for staying, for believing." Eliza smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "We saved each other," she said, "and we'll keep saving each other." Outside, the world was quiet, but inside, something new was being born, a life built not just on survival, but on love, trust, and the promise of tomorrow. The farm, once heavy with loss and loneliness, now sang with the sound of family, of hearts mended and hope rekindled. And Thomas knew, deep down, that no matter what came next, this was where he belonged.